All right, let's talk about tolerance, withdrawal, sensitization, and conditioning effects of drugs. Okay, let's first define drug tolerance. Right now, it's important that you understand that all we are doing right now is defining drug tolerance. We're not yet addressing how it develops or why it develops. We're simply giving a definition for drug tolerance. Okay? So, what is drug tolerance? Drug tolerance describes a condition where more of a drug is necessary to produce the desired effect. Okay? Or another way of saying that is when the current dosage or dose of a drug no longer produces the desired effect. Okay? So, drug tolerance, condition where more of a drug, an increased dose, is necessary to produce the desired effects. Okay? Or in other words, the current dose no longer produces the desired effect. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to briefly talk about some types of tolerance before we move on to talking about how it develops and why it develops. Okay, so we're talking about some types of tolerance. The first type is called cross tolerance. Okay, whenever we talk about cross tolerance, we are generally talking about two or more drugs that are in the same class. So, for example, if we were talking about painkillers or if we were talking about stimulants, okay? So, I'm just making that point to be sure that you understand we're not comparing apples and oranges, okay? So, when we talk about cross tolerance, we're saying if tolerance develops to the effects associated with one drug, then it's likely that tolerance will also develop to the same effect of a closely related drug. Okay? So if tolerance develops to the effect of one drug, okay, then tolerance will also likely develop to the same effect of a closely related drug. Okay? So in other words, some effect associated with drug A is no longer apparent at a specific dose. So that means if I took drug B, which is closely related, does the same thing as drug A, then I'm not likely to get the desired effect at, with drug B either. Okay, cross tolerance, tolerance across a class of drugs, but we're talking about the same effect. So we're not talking about effect X of drug A and effect, Y of drug B. We're talking about the same effect. So if tolerance develops to the effect of one drug, then it's likely that tolerance will also develop to the same effect of a closely related drug. Okay? Now let's move on to tachyphylaxis. Tachyphylaxis is a term that's used to describe tolerance developing after a single administration of a drug. Okay, so the individual takes the drug, it produces the desired effect. The next time that the individual takes the drug, that same effect is diminished. Okay, or they don't get that expected or desired effect. Okay, and when we talk about tachyphylaxis, when we talk about tolerance that develops after a single administration, another way we say that is tolerance developing from one administration to the next. Sometimes that could be a matter of hours or days, but anytime after that first administration, whenever that second administration is encountered, then the expected effect is not achieved. Okay, that's tachyphylaxis. Okay, acute tolerance describes the type of tolerance that develops while the drug is still in the individual system. Okay, so the drug is still in the bloodstream. This is the type of tolerance that develops while the drug is still in the bloodstream. Okay, more specifically, acute tolerance describes a condition where the effects of the drug that are experienced when the blood levels of the drug are rising are different from the effects that are experienced when the blood levels of the drug are falling. Okay, so again, with acute tolerance, a type of tolerance that develops while the drug is still in the individual system, still in the bloodstream. Okay, the effects that are experienced when the blood levels of the drug are rising are different from the effects that are experienced when the blood levels of the drug are falling. Okay, so let me give you an example that will hopefully help you understand this comment. The effects of alcohol, or alcohol is a drug whose effects are associated with acute tolerance. Okay, so consider when blood levels, when an individual first starts drinking and the blood levels of alcohol or alcohol blood levels are starting to rise. That's generally when an individual feels that lightheadedness, that buzz, as we often refer to it, or they feel a little euphoria, a little happiness, excitation. Okay? But as that individual continues drinking, okay, and the alcohol has been absorbed into the system, the blood levels peak. And then once that alcohol, starts to become metabolized and the blood levels start to fall, okay, then on that side of the curve, sometimes the individual's experiencing the sedative effects of alcohol. Maybe they're getting a little sleepy, a little lethargic, okay? So the effects that are experienced when the blood levels of the drug are rising are different from the effects that are experienced when the blood levels of the drug are falling. Now let me just explain something right here. When we say that the blood levels of the drug are falling, that is not in any way suggesting that the blood levels are low. When we use that type of language to say the blood levels of the drug are falling, we mean that all of the drug has been absorbed from the site of administration into the bloodstream, okay? And now, and so at that point, the levels are very high, okay? And then we're saying that because it's all in the bloodstream, now the liver is going to secrete enzymes, start to break it down, and so the blood levels start to fall, okay? So in this case, the blood levels, when the blood levels that are falling are still much higher than those that are experienced when the blood levels are just rising when an individual first starts to drink. Okay? I apologize for that. I keep hitting the wrong button. Okay? Now, let's continue our discussion of some different types of tolerance. Okay? We have what's called general or non-specific tolerance. Okay? This describes a situation where tolerance develops to all effects of the drug and to the same extent. Okay, another way of perhaps saying this was that the drug no longer produces any effect, okay, because we're saying that it's general or it's non-specific. The tolerance that we're talking about is not restricted to effect A or effect B. We're saying this drug no longer does anything, or the current dose of this drug no longer does anything that we expect it to do. Now, not likely that this would happen, but let's go back to an example we used back in chapter 1 when we talked about aspirin. Okay, remember we said aspirin could be used to relieve headaches. Remember we said that, and so that would be a primary effect. And remember we said that it could also cause nausea, a side effect, or, the fact that it's a blood thinner. And that was also a side effect. So let's assume that individual has been taking a dose of aspirin, for some period of time. And let's say that general or non-specific tolerance develops. That would mean that aspirin no longer has the ability to relieve headaches. It would not have the ability to be an effective blood thinner. We know that's not going to happen. So this is why I'm saying this is just an example. It would no longer have the ability to be effective blood thinner, and it no longer upsets the stomach, okay? So if we're saying that everything, all the effects associated with that drug are affected to the same extent, okay, the drug no longer does anything we expect it to do, that would be general or non-specific tolerance. When we talk about specific tolerance, we're talking about a type of tolerance that develops to one effect associated with the drug, but the drug still has the ability to produce its other effects. Okay, so with specific tolerance, tolerance develops to one or a specific effect associated with the drug, but it maintains its ability to produce its other effects. So if we use that same example of the aspirin, let's imagine that the aspirin no longer relieves my headache, but it still upsets my stomach. Okay, that's specific tolerance. Tolerance develops to one effect associated with the drug, but the drug maintains its ability to produce its other effects. When we talk about behavioral tolerance, okay, we're talking about individuals learning how to do things or carry out their everyday functions with the drug in their system. Okay, behavioral tolerance. You learn to function when there is drug circulating in your bloodstream. Okay, if we use alcohol as an example, you've probably heard individuals referred to as functional alcoholics because they're able to do the things that they're supposed to do, while they are technically drunk. Okay, so you have many individuals that learn to mask the effects that the drugs are having on them. They learn to carry out their everyday functions while they are drunk, while they are under the influence of various drugs. Okay, and one of the terms, remember that we used in chapter 2 with the behavioral analysis of drug effects, was that dissociation, people learning how to do things under the influence of a drug, and then those things are more difficult in a non-drug state. And so oftentimes when you have behavioral tolerance develop, you have functional alcoholics, very often those people perform functions better when they're drunk than when they're sober. Okay, now let's talk briefly about mechanisms of tolerance. So this is getting to the how. How does tolerance develop? Okay, so remember, so far we've only talked about the definition and some types of tolerance. Now we're going to talk about how tolerance develops. Okay, and so we're going to have two categories. This first one is going to be what we call pharmacodynamic tolerance, which is also known as functional or non-associative tolerance. So when you see that word pharmacodynamic, we're talking about changes, okay, changes that are induced because of a pharmacological substance. But anytime you see something like this, pharmacodynamic tolerance, we're talking about something physiological, something biological, okay? And it's known as non-associative tolerance because it does not involve any learning. So when we use that word associative here, and I see that I have too many S's here, but it's too late to correct that, so I apologize for that. But when we talk about non-associative tolerance, this is a type of tolerance that does not involve any learning. As a matter of fact, pharmacodynamic tolerance does not involve any learning. Okay, so here I'm only giving one example of pharmacodynamic tolerance. That is metabolic tolerance, what we also call dispositional tolerance. Metabolic tolerance, okay, is an increased ability of the body to metabolize a drug, okay? And that increased ability to metabolize a drug is due to what we call enzyme induction, or the increased production of enzymes, okay? Again, metabolic tolerance is an increase in the body's ability to metabolize a drug due to enzyme induction, or the increased production of enzymes. So in other words, the liver produces more enzymes, and because more enzymes have been produced, the body can break down a drug more quickly. Okay, so you should be able to kind of start thinking about this on your own in terms of, well, if more enzymes are produced, which allows the body to break down a drug faster, what's going to happen? What are the consequences? Okay, so if the drug is being broken down more quickly, okay, then that means that the amount of drug that you took is not going to produce the desired effects. Okay, that means that less drug is going to reach the site of action. That means that blood levels aren't going to peak as they're expected. Okay, that means you're going to need more. drug to produce the desired effect, okay? Because some of the drug, much of the drug is getting broken down much more quickly. Now, you may say that sounds a little bit familiar. Here we're talking about metabolic tolerance, increased production of enzymes, breaking down the drug more quickly, which means that you're not going to get the desired effect. It's not going to all reach the site of action, which is why you don't get the desired effect. That the blood levels aren't going to peak, as you would have expected, because it's getting broken down much more quickly. And all of that means that you're going to need more of the drug to produce the desired effect. So you see where we're going with this tolerance? Because you got enzymes breaking down the drug very, very quickly, it means you're going to need to take more and more to get the effect that you're trying to achieve. Okay? Now, let me back up a second, because I said you may say those things sound familiar. Because remember we talked about first pass metabolism. Now, first pass metabolism does not have to do with increased enzyme production per se, but metabolism is still metabolism, okay? That you're breaking down drugs. So with first pass metabolism, you're breaking down some before it gets to where it needs to go. So that means that, less drug is going to reach the site of action, not going to have the desired effect. You're going to need more. Here we're talking about enzymes, lots of enzymes present to break down a drug more quickly, which means the same thing. That drug's not all of it's going to get to where it needs to go, which means that you're not going to get the desired effect, which means that you need more to produce the desired effect. So hopefully you can see that, whenever we talk about metabolism, it's going to have some significant effects in terms of whether or not the drug is going to do what you expect it to do and how much you need in order to get the expected effects. Okay? Now, the second category is context-specific tolerance, which is also known as behavioral or learned or associative tolerance. So in your study guide, you may see a question that says, what's the major difference between pharmacodynamic tolerance and context-specific tolerance? Okay? And so the thing here is that simply one, context-specific tolerance involves learning. Pharmacodynamic tolerance does not. The pharmacodynamic tolerance deals with physiology, biological things. Context-specific tolerance deals with learning. Okay? So our best examples here are habituation. Okay? Habituation is often defined as a simple form of learning. Okay? So for example, if we put mice in an open field box and have them run around, okay, let's say we put them in there for 15 minutes. During the first 5 minutes, when you initially put them in there, it's a novel environment and they're going to run around. As the time goes on, okay, they're going to see that, wow, I'm running around this box. It's just an empty box. There's nothing new here to see. And so they're learning that this is no longer really novel. There's nothing to see. Been there, done that. I've run around this box a couple of times. And so their activity is going to decrease over that 15-minute period, okay? Because the animal is learning that, okay, the novelty is decreasing as I continue moving around this box, okay? So it's a simple form of learning, okay? Another way that we can define habituation is that the first time a stimulus is presented, the organism responds. Okay? Now, if the stimulus is presented over and over in the same manner, okay, so we're not changing anything about how, when, where that stimulus is presented, then the organism's response is going to be reduced. Okay, we call that habituation. Again, when a stimulus is presented the first time, the organism responds. If the stimulus is presented over and over again in the same manner, then the organism's response is going to be reduced, and we call that habituation. Now, let me give you an example that may give you a chuckle. I've been using the same example for about 14 years now. Because, I felt like it was really funny because it's something that happened with me. I moved to Memphis from upstate New York, and I moved to Memphis just after straight line winds had come through the area. So there'd actually been a hurricane in Memphis, even though we are this far in from water, okay? But I got to Memphis on, I think, a Saturday. So, kind of tried to settle into the city, went to work Monday, went to work Tuesday, and at that time there were still a lot of areas in the city that did not have electricity, etc. So Wednesday I go to work. Okay, I had dropped my daughter off at daycare, and I'm at work, and then at 3:30, anybody see where I'm going? The storm sirens go off. Okay, so 3:30, the storm sirens go off. Now, here is Dr. Cook, the newbie to Memphis, realizing that just the previous week, a horrible storm came through Memphis. So I hear the storm sirens. I start freaking out. Where's the nearest shelter? Where am I supposed to go? Where are they going to take my kid at the daycare? Okay, anybody see where we're going? The first time that a stimulus is presented, the organism responds. Okay, now, people told me that, oh, don't worry. Okay, now look at this. If the stimulus is presented over and over in the same manner, i.e., every Wednesday at 3:30, then the organism's response is reduced. Okay, so I'm assuming that many of you, live in the Memphis area, or if not, maybe you know a little bit about Memphis. But that storm siren goes off every Wednesday at 3:30. Okay, and we are so used to that happening that many of us don't even pay attention to it. That's habituation. Okay, when a stimulus is presented the first time, Dr. Cook moves to Memphis, that storm siren goes off and she freaks out. Okay, but when the stimulus is presented over and over in the same manner every Wednesday at 3:30, then the response is reduced. Okay, I hear it, but I don't react to it. Okay, now here's the neat thing. We know that if that siren goes off anytime other than a Wednesday at 3:30, then we need to pay attention. Okay, but habituation. Okay. Our second mechanism of tolerance under context-specific tolerance is Pavlovian conditioning, Pavlov and his dogs. I briefly reviewed that in Chapter 2, but I believe I have a slide right after this to review it again. Yes, so let's briefly go through Pavlovian conditioning again. Remember that it's also called classical conditioning. Okay, so let's briefly go back through the scenario. I'm not going to get specific with the details, but Pavlov presented the dogs with food. Okay, the dogs would salivate. Okay, remember the food is considered a UCS, or an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, it's considered an unconditioned stimulus because the dog does not have to learn anything about the food in order for the salivation to occur. Okay, and so the salivation is the UCR, or the unconditioned response. Okay, so the unconditioned response is the response that occurs after the presentation of an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits a response in the absence of any learning. Okay, again, a UCS, or an unconditioned stimulus, is a stimulus that elicits a response in the absence of any learning. So an unconditioned response is the response that occurs after presentation of an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, now I've included this NS here in parentheses. It's not a term that people use often, but sometimes I like to give an intermediate step before we introduce the CS. I put the NS there because sometimes some of us talk about what we call a neutral stimulus. So when this stimulus is produced, it doesn't elicit any effect. It doesn't mean anything to the organism. Okay, now what I should have done here was kind of probably put an arrow that the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. Okay, so let's go back for a second. So remember, Pavlov presented the food, the dogs would salivate. Okay, then what he started doing was ringing a bell. Okay, when he presented the food. Okay, so I like to include that NS so that you understand that when he initially, that first time that he presented the bell with the food, it meant nothing to the dogs. Okay, so it was neutral in a sense. Okay, but we're going to see that after he rang the bell every time that he presented the food, the bell became what we call a conditioned stimulus. Okay, so a conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that fails to elicit a response on its own, but does after it's been paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so in other words, the bell doesn't produce a response on its own, but it did after it was always paired with the food. Okay, so again, a conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that initially fails to elicit a response, but does after it's been paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Okay? Now, CR stands for conditioned response. Okay? Now, what Pavlov was eventually able to do was just present the bell. Okay? And because the dogs had learned that the bell was associated with presentation of the food, they would salivate in response to presentation of the bell. Okay? So the salivation in response to just the presentation of the bell is a conditioned response. Okay? So the conditioned response is the response that occurs after the presentation of the conditioned stimulus. Okay? Now, why is this important? Okay? Drugs and stimuli that are related to the drug become conditioned to the effects of a drug. Okay? Now, the important thing to understand here is it doesn't mean that when someone sees, so for example, let me back up for just a second. So let's say the crack pipe, okay, would be, before the individual, if the individual's never smoked crack, then the crack pipe would not mean anything to the individual. Okay, but once the individual participates in those behaviors, okay, and associates getting high with the crack pipe, then the crack pipe by itself is not going to cause the individual to become high. But what it will do is that individual's body and brain is going to have the expectation of getting high. And in the absence of actually smoking crack, they will have cravings. So this is why when individuals see or experience certain stimuli, they can evoke cravings because they have become conditioned to the effects of the drug. Okay? Sometimes that's hard for people to wrap their minds around some of these conditioning concepts, why is this now important? But if you think about it, I'm not sure if you remember, or maybe you've heard it, it's an oldie now, but there was a song that I think the title was Always Something There to Remind Me. That's what conditioning is about. I walk along the city streets you used to walk along with me, and every step I take reminds me of just how it used to be. So it's when you're in a place and you get a feeling because you're in that place because there were some emotions or something that were associated with that place. In the same way, drug paraphernalia, the things that are associated with taking drugs, can become conditioned to the effects of the drug, so that when an individual is around that paraphernalia or even around the money that gets exchanged when people are buying drugs, then those things can evoke cravings. Okay, so you're not going to get high just by looking at a crack pipe, but the brain and the body are going to have the expectation of getting high, and in the absence of getting high, those things will evoke cravings. Okay? So this is just a little slide that I put together to reinforce this concept of conditioning. So let's imagine that we inject a dog with a drug that makes it sick. Okay? And let's say that a bell is ringing while it's getting sick. Okay? So you'll see over here that the getting sick part, I can't get my mouse to show up, but the getting sick part is the unconditioned response. Okay, they don't have to learn anything about a drug because it's a drug that would naturally make the animal nauseous. Okay, or nauseated, excuse me, that make the animal nauseated. And you're presenting a bell while they're getting sick. Anybody see where we're going with this example? Okay, so that if you simply ring the bell, then the animal should get sick. Okay? And so the bell, which was previously a neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, One that if you would simply ring a bell by itself, this animal would not get sick. But because the bell was rang during the time that the drug was making the animal nauseated, ringing the bell is able to cause the nausea. Okay? So we'll stop here and pick up in the next section.